Welcome. Thanks for everybody, for joining us for lunch. I see a whole lot of new faces for HRC, so that's exciting for us to have some new people here with us in the Equality Forum, and so thank you for joining us. My name is Ty Cobb. I am not the former White House counsel or related to him, just to make everybody clear on that up front. I do direct our global programs here at the Human Rights Campaign. And for those who aren't familiar with HRC or the Human Rights Campaign, I just want to tell you just a slight bit about us. We're an organization that was founded in 1980, so we're about to celebrate our 40th birthday. We're not too far away right now. We are the largest lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer civil rights organization in the United States, with 3 million members and supporters across the country. In 2013, HRC really made a shift and expanded our domestic mission to also include being able to work on U.S. foreign policies and engaging with our peers who are LGBTQ advocates abroad in a more significant way. And that really brings us here today, some of that work. And we just wrapped up what we call our Global Innovative Advocacy Summit that we've had for 3 years now. We have it every April, and it brings together some of the greatest advocates doing incredible work in countries around the world to make change for LGBTQ people in their countries. And so I just want to say I'm excited that one of our 2018 Global Innovators, Hassan Kalani, is actually on the panel, so we're thrilled to have him. He just wrapped up a fellowship here in the U.S. and heads back to Jordan tomorrow. So this is a bit of his farewell, so give him a big applause when he comes up here. And I've been asked to give some housekeeping items, always the fun stuff. One, letting folks know that the bathrooms are in the back, and so there's a women's bathroom over here, a men's bathroom over here, and a single-cell stall out in the hallway. In addition, I was told everybody make sure to silence their cell phones if you haven't already. Pull them out, put them on silence. For folks using Twitter or Facebook or Instagram and want a hashtag, the hashtag for the event is LGBTQ Mideast, M-I-D-E-A-S-T, so LGBTQ Mideast. I also want to thank the Middle East Institute for reaching out and wanting to partner on this lunch today. It was really an amazing partnership to bring some new folks together to host a conversation and a discussion that I think a lot of folks here are obviously excited about. And from the MEI team, I really want to thank Antun Issa for his work, Jessica Agostinelli for her work, as well as Najla Al-Suderi for her work in pulling this all together with our team. I also want to thank the folks from our team that have been part of this at HRC, Karina Hendron, F.A. Songrum, Jean Friedberg, Jeremy Cadden, and Saurav Thapa. And lastly, I want to flag something that's coming up in this space later this month that some of you may be interested in. We're going to be hosting on May 24th with the Interfaith Alliance and Qasir Khan a iftar. And so if anyone is interested in joining us, please let us know. We have a pretty full event right now, so we have a waiting list, but I think we're going to be easily able to move people into the event as it gets closer. And so F.A., who's back over here, wave your hand. If you want to join the iftar and join us on the 24th, be sure to give your business card to F.A., and we can make sure to get back with you on that. And so now, without further ado, I want to welcome Paul Salem from the Middle East Institute. He's the Senior Vice President for Policy, Research, and Programs, and he's going to come up and say a few words.
Thank you, Ty.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ty.
There you go.
Thank you, Ty. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Paul Salem from the Middle East Institute. We're very pleased to co-host this event today, examining the important and often overlooked issues of LGBTQ communities in the Middle East, the ongoing challenges they face, potential areas of hope. Definitely want to thank HRC for hosting us here in their Equality Forum and for helping to shine light on this important issue, and to the HRC team for their help in organizing this event, especially Karina Hendron, Jeremy Cadden, and Ty Cobb. The Arab uprisings in 2011 were inspired by a broad desire for political change, and the movements also opened up space for new social conversations surrounding gender identity, and sexual orientation. Online activism and grassroots organizing have empowered these communities to advocate for greater visibility and to fight for their rights. However, despite achievements in some countries, including the launch of an LGBT radio station in Tunisia, the organization of the first Pride Parade in Beirut, there still persists a great deal of oppression, discrimination, and even criminalization of LGBTQ people across the region. What are the most pressing challenges facing these communities in the Middle East? What have been some landmark court cases that may bring about a change? Who are the leading figures in advocating for greater LGBT rights in their countries? Here to discuss these questions, we're lucky to have an excellent panel moderated by our good friend Steve Clemens. Steve is the Washington editor-at-large for The Atlantic and editor of Atlantic Live. He's also a senior fellow and the founder of the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation here in Washington, D.C., a prolific writer and esteemed source on politics and foreign affairs. Very excited to have him to guide today's discussion. So, Steve, on to you and the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you so much, Jessica. Big round for Jessica and Paul and Ty. Thank you all very much for being here. And let me tell you who we have. It really is an outstanding panel. This is not an overstatement today. We have Antun Issa, who is he's been a journalist, commentator in Middle Eastern affairs. And he is director of public relations at the Middle East Institute, and I think this was your brainchild, right? And one of the things I want to note is while we are at the Human Rights Campaign, and I know when and I'm so thankful to HRC for what it's done. I remember, I'm not going to age anyone else here, but when I was sort of coming out in the early 1980s, so do the math, it was hard. You know, when we're talking about other cultures, other societies, and where they're at, it's useful to think back to our own country in the United States and just how much shifting there has happened and how that's evolved both legally, culturally, politically, etc. And so it's good to be here. But the Middle East Institute has not had an LGBTQ forum. I see my friend Rob Satloff of the Washington Institute for Near. Have you had an LGBTQ forum yet? I think there should be one at WinUp, right? So maybe we can kind of spread this and go viral. So very good to have Antun and thank him for his leadership. Then we have, as was just mentioned, Hassan Kilani, who's a fellow at the Heartland Alliance International. He's a Jordanian human rights activist, currently working as a fellow for the Heartland Alliance in Chicago, where he's a Sudan Task Force project manager, and we will get into the entire region with him. Then we have May El-Sidani, who is a non-resident fellow with the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, and she's going to talk to us also about the region and really about legal frames and legal frameworks and where those are. And then we have someone who lives in this house, Jeremy Cadden, who is Senior International Policy Advocate for the Human Rights Campaign. And of course, we can't not talk about Washington in Washington, so he's going to look at the kind of broad Middle East question, but of course, as we narcissistically think about DC, where we are there. But let me start out here. I occasionally, and I want to give Rob a shout out here, I occasionally, because of Rob Satloff, occasionally get in, because I feel guilty, we have a show we do together, and I get in and I read the press in as many of the Middle East countries as I can and get in, usually English language, but sometimes foreign language, but to try to look at what is really going on. Because over here, you would just think the debate is all about the Iran deal, or it's about women driving in Saudi Arabia, or it's about some dimension of Syria. But there are so many other stories that get neglected in our conversation over here and what we're doing. And so it's useful to look at what people see as their various right struggles. And those right struggles may not be the ones we're talking about today so clearly in the press, but occasionally they are. And occasionally they're about a lot of other things: property rights disputes, intellectual disputes, rivalries of different sorts. And as you go through the region, if you kind of give yourself a little tour of some of the papers that are available, it's a fascinating journey, and I recommend it. So as we start this, I'm going to start with you, Antun. I'd really love to know, as we're discussing, this snapshot of the LGBTQ situation in the region, why does it matter? How does it fall within other priorities, and what do you think it means, and why should we know more about it?
Well, I'll just preface that by saying it wasn't a coincidence that this event was organized the same week that Trump was going to make his announcement with the Iran deal. But I think I think it's kind of like a good contrast to see. You've got this massive story that's dominating headlines, which is mostly about state security, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and they're the kind of stories that keep surfacing on a regular basis. But if you go back to the Arab Spring and even the Iran protests recently, those conversations aren't necessarily dominating the conversations that's on the ground level. Those protests were mostly about human security issues and pressures. So it's, the conversations that are had on the ground are mostly about how can I get to the end of the day? How can I feed my family? How can I get a job? How can I get electricity running in this country? How can I, if I say this word, will I get imprisoned and tortured for it? Those are the questions that most people in the region deal with on a daily basis. It's about daily survival. So it's important not just to have LGBT discussions, but also discussions on human security issues in general, because those pressures are still there, they're accelerating, they're not going anywhere. We'll see more protests in the future because they're not being addressed. So I guess when it comes to the policy question in Washington, D.C., do we just focus on stability in terms of making sure Saudi Arabia and Iran and Israel don't go to war with each other, or do we also come up with policies that address those human security pressures, rights for individuals, better economic development and so forth, that will essentially help guarantee real stability going forward in the long term?
Let me just dig a little bit deeper with you, and May, I'm going to bring you in you next. But as we talk about this, I mean, I would say, I'm going to be, how do I be respectful and demeaning of my family at the same time? My relatives in the Midwest, in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, when they think about, it took them a while to get over me being gay, but as they think about, as they've tried to become more enlightened on these issues, they look at the Middle East as just an awful place for rights for women, rights for gays. They don't really see it as a black and white issue. What do you hope for us to understand as we talk about this here? Is it a black and white issue? Is the LGBTQ agenda in the Middle East a realistic one to promulgate?
Absolutely, I think, if you just take the example of, I guess, the difference between the approaches between the Obama and Trump administrations and whether they have an impact on the region, and you can see that kind of grey zone, so it's not black and white. So for example, Egypt recently did a crackdown on, a very public crackdown. It was across the media, state TV, state media and so forth. It was a real punching bag for gay people in Egypt for about 3-4 months, and they rounded up about 80 of them, put them in jail and so forth. That was met with complete silence from Washington, D.C. Previously, under the Obama administration, you kind of got used to having those kind of statements come out saying, calling you out. I think my microphone's going in and out. But calling states out for those kind of oppressive behaviours when it came to LGBT communities, vulnerable LGBT communities. And so that kind of, it doesn't stop the repression, but at least draws a line. And it says and sends a message to these governments saying, okay, well, look, if you, we're not going to tell you to make homosexuality legal, but if you, there's also a limit to how far you can go. Those limits are gone now, and so just to bring that back to the region, that's really felt in the region. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that even though homosexuality is outlawed across the whole Middle East, there are kind of grey zones where you can kind of operate in places and where there are boundaries to how far the oppression can go. And so the United States plays a huge role in determining where that line is, and I think that kind of demonstrates, yeah.
Thank you. Hey, May, there's a guy some of you may know, Warren Coates. Warren was for a long time with the IMF. He happens to be I'm not outing him, but he happens to be a finance expert who is gay. And one of the books he wrote once was really how to make hard currencies in unstable regions, like places like Bosnia or Afghanistan or Iraq. How do you make a currency work? And so I've always sort of looked at what you do in the legal areas. How do you make legal rights work in toxic environments? And I would love to get an understanding of how you think about what the opportunities are from a legal frame, much to what Antun was going through. Of, one, give us a snapshot of where you think things are, and how do you make rights resilient in kind of crappy circumstances, if I may?
Not a difficult question at all. But yeah, no, thank you all for the opportunity to be here. But answering your question, I think it's important to view the LGBT crackdown in the Middle East, in addition to being its own beast, as also in the midst of a larger crackdown, a larger rights-based crackdown. Countries in the Middle East are cracking down against people who are different, against independent thought, against anyone who challenges the status quo. And I think it's really helpful to place it in that context, both because it gives us the larger picture of what's happening, but it also creates coalitions between human rights lawyers, between organizations. What we're seeing in the wake of this crackdown is actually unprecedented in that civil society organizations that historically have not worked on LGBT rights are coming together and issuing statements of solidarity, which is remarkable.
Could you give us some examples
Sure.
so that people know?
Historically in Egypt, after this most recent crackdown in Egypt, in which the Mashroua Layla concert, in which the rainbow flag was raised, about 75 people were arrested in Egypt related to that incident, and then 10 others in related incidents in the weeks thereafter. So for a total of 85 people, which is a huge amount, in a very public crackdown. The Supreme Media Council issued a media gag where you could no longer talk about homosexuality unless it was being addressed as a sickness or it was being addressed as something that could be cured. So very problematic environment. But in contrast to that, the civil society community came together, and you had a statement issued within a matter of days, signed by 50 civil society organizations, many of whom regional organizations, many of whom didn't work on just this issue. And the fact that they came together so quickly, the fact that for the first time ever, many human rights lawyers were defending people in these cases, whereas historically they might have strayed away from it or perhaps taken a different approach, like arguing a right to privacy or a right to health. The fact that the right to be different and the right to not be protected from discrimination is being used in the everyday language of lawyers is a really a huge improvement, I would say.
Could you give us a quick snapshot of Egypt today? You know, you had essentially Morsi elected, the Muslim Brotherhood comes into power. I don't know where you would have benchmarked on a scale of 1 to 10 LGBTQ rights under that regime. Now you have Sisi who's back. Are things better for the LGBTQ crowd, worse, the same?
Actually, no. The crackdown is stronger than ever. And the ironic part of that is that one of President Sisi's tools is that he often frames himself as religious out of the fear that because he removed the Muslim Brotherhood, a religious body, people would think he's not religious enough. And the reality is the community in Egypt, the population is fairly religious. So that's an argument that works well with them. And the fact that he is posing himself as this religious protector helps facilitate that crackdown. You'll note that Sisi is cracking down against many groups, but oftentimes, unfortunately, the LGBT community is cracked down against explicitly because, unfortunately, there's popular support for that sentiment. And that's where our efforts to promote public diplomacy, to do social media awareness videos, all these things can be extremely powerful, because when you start to change that perception, that's when you really start to see change, and there will be pushback against the laws and practices that are in place.
Hassan Kalani, one of the things that he has done in his past, which is so fascinating to me, is operating in Jordan, set up the UNHCR, UN High Commissioner for Refugees. So dealing with refugees and set up their LGBT protection program, dealing, I assume, with those that were refugees in the country, Palestinians, Syrians, and others. And I'm interested in, as you have approached this, particularly, you know, one of the challenges I always have in this time that we're in is people look back at what it might have been possible under one presidential administration, and they want that back. And the Nixonian side, let's deal with issues as they are. What's possible with the Trump administration or with Congress? We'll get down here to Congress in a moment. But as you look at it, I know that you have some concern that the United States walking away from this issue has created real consequences.
True, very true. I mean, in that time, I have to say, like, always refugees have to go somewhere. If they can't come to the U.S., they will go somewhere. And Jordan was like, I mean, and still, it's like the country has literally 700,000 Syrian refugees and a lot from the region, from Yemen, from Iraq, from Sudan, from Somalia, from different countries, plus the LGBTQ refugees who's coming from the region as well to seek asylum. And I think before, the U.S. used to take a big number of refugees, which has included the LGBTI persons who really would be having a hard time to find a job in Jordan, because it's already very hard for Jordanians to, being a Jordanian and LGBTQ, you face lots of discrimination. So on the top of that, you are a refugee. That would be really make the discrimination even way worse, and plus also the housing discrimination. There was lots of discriminations in Jordan. Yes, of course, Jordan is one of the countries that does not criminalize homosexuality, but yet there is a social stigma around it. And plus that being a refugee, that is really, again, the issue. And now the US has stepped out of taking these refugees, including the LGBTI refugees, and not mentioning only the United States, but we also know and we are aware that also Europe is closing the doors day by day. It's every day, and that is really causing a lot of conflicts. And unfortunately, nowadays, the refugees in Jordan, they really have no place except a lot of issues comes with the sex work, and which also raise the stigmas against LGBTQ, because now this is another step that we see, like they need to survive. There is no work, there is no countries giving them another opportunities, and the stigma is really now an increasing backlash against the Jordanian plus the refugees LGBT community.
Antu?
Yeah, I wanted to add to that.
Lift it up a little bit.
Okay. I was talking about that there.
Your chest is just too big.
A lot of fish and chips in Australia. Okay, let's have a look at that. Let's do that.
There you go.
All right. Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to add to what Hassan just said with some real examples of what this actually means. So when I was living in Beirut, I was working very closely with, I wasn't working closely, but I was kind of associated, working with a US NGO called IRAP, and I suggest people look them up. They do a lot of excellent work in trying to get LGBT refugees from Middle East trouble zones into the US. And under the Obama administration, that was working fine. They worked primarily on Iraq and getting Iraqi LGBT refugees, moving them to safe houses in Lebanon, and then doing the processes with the US Embassy there, and then resettling them here.
So they were seeking asylum, essentially,
Yes. And that was working fine under the Obama administration. They were getting processed. And just to give like a real example of what that means, I met a lot of young, one young Iraqi from Baghdad who, had bruises and burnt marks all over his body. His family had, obviously disowned him because of the shame of, dishonoring the family and so forth. And IRAP were working really in clandestine operations in Lebanon. They had to put them in safe houses in Lebanon because their families would come to Lebanon trying to hunt them down to kill them. So their lives are under threat. And so when the doors are shut to Europe and the US, it's just putting these lives in danger. They've got nowhere to go. It's not so. This is to kind of, stress the point that there are variances in the degrees of oppression in the Middle East. Lebanon it's not legal, but it's more tolerated than, say, Iraq or, Egypt or other countries and so forth. So for an Iraqi LGBT person who's trying to escape Iraq, they're trying to save their lives. And so just to kind of stress the point of why this is so important, when you have a change in administration who's now closing the doors, you're putting lives at risk.
Which we're going to get to the political question here in just a moment. But before I leave you, Hassan, what given your experience there, and particularly in Jordan, I'm sort of fascinated by the contradictions in Jordan. There's kind of this tension between both a conservatism and a kind of liberal ethic to a certain degree too. There's a lot more tolerance there. But I think what's interesting to talk about, taking a snapshot, are there any advocacy strategies that work in a place like Jordan?
Yes, sure. Definitely we work now with lots of, we try as much as possible to be involved in the civil society. As a Jordanian activist, we're very much connected. We try as much as possible to be responding to any emergency comes up. Also, I have to say, the magazine, in My Cali magazine, it's a Jordanian magazine that really was focusing on lots of LGBTQ issues in the past 10 years. Unfortunately, with the backlash of a parliament member, it has been blocked online. But now we're trying also to get back to the point where advocate to have it published again after this 10 years of work. So there is some advocacy, and it's basically mostly we're ready to respond for emergency issues.
And do you feel safe doing what you're doing? Do you feel like you have enough support structures, people, communities helping behind the scenes? I'm always intrigued by this because it is you are at risk doing what you're doing. You believe in what you're doing, or maybe you don't think about it all. Maybe it's just we're worried for you. Is that are there support structures in families and others, even if they're less visible and less public, that you feel you're standing on something solid?
I mean, personally, I have a family who supports, and there are, I mean, if you open the radio station sometimes and you hear stories of families that also support, the thing is, you're definitely, as many of the region, you're definitely not completely safe. If you're safer from the government, you're not safer from the extremists. And we had an incident a few years ago where as a caricature or cartoonist was just drawing the image of God like just being sarcastic against ISIS, and he was shot in Jordan. So the risk is there. But also there is no advocacy, and we cannot call it activism if we were not able to bear that risk as well.
Jeremy, you cover Congress, the political situation, and I mean, you're probably very fine, but I'm sort of asking you, 1 to 10, where would you say the U.S. government is in terms of supporting healthier civil rights across the board in the Middle East?
Yeah, thanks. I'd say it depends on what part of the U.S. government you're talking about. So I think
let's start with the White House.
So the White House, I think I'd have to give them a pretty low score, and that's not without lack of effort on the part of LGBT people here in the U.S. who are trying to push them to speak out. And the Trump administration at the top levels has really refused to say anything about the Egyptian crackdown, what happened in Chechnya last year. There's just been far too many opportunities for them to speak out that they have not seized upon. So whether it's Trump or Pence or former Secretary Tillerson, and of course, Secretary Pompeo doesn't come in with a record that we're optimistic about. But at the same time, I think, unlike his predecessor, I think he does have some familiarity with the concept of human rights. I don't think that Tillerson really thought about human rights prior to becoming Secretary of State. So, we'll see how broad his vision is of human rights. But, as I said, we're not terribly optimistic. At the same time, though, I do want to point out that there are allies within the State Department and within USAID who are still, pushing their issues as far as they can. They're not getting support from the top the way they used to, and that's certainly disappointing. But they're doing what they can to continue that effort. So we do see, funding still going to some folks in the Middle East to help the groups to grow and to be a little bit more public, step by step as they can go along. And there's still policies that they're trying to get into place at State and USAID, and we do see some incremental progress even while the top levels either ignore it or frankly have antipathy towards the issue on occasion.
Congress.
Oh, right, Congress. Yes, of course, them too. So Congress is super interesting.
Do they matter?
They do. They really do. They can't get their act together to pass legislation, but they do a lot in terms of foreign policy in more individual kind of ways. So what we've seen is that Congress really does engage in the Middle East in particular because of historical ties, energy issues, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all that kind of stuff. They really engage in the Middle East in a way that is kind of unique in the world. And so you can get members of Congress to really sort of lean in on the Middle East on human rights issues and even on LGBT issues. And you begin to see Republicans speaking out on these issues in a way that you might not see them do on the domestic LGBTQ side. They don't want to go home and have their domestic constituents say, hey, when you support LGBTQ rights, although our opponents probably don't say LGBTQ, but when you support gay rights or whatever, you're trampling on my religious freedom. That might happen on the domestic side, but when they're talking internationally, when they're talking about people being thrown in prison, tortured, even executed, then that's a little bit less problematic for people in Kansas or Texas or Oklahoma, just to name a few random states that just jump to mind. So I think that there's an opportunity there for the Republicans, and some are beginning to seize that. And so when they go abroad, I hear that some of them are beginning to raise the issues when they meet with other governments. I'd encourage them to do it more. We're always looking for who's going on the next trip abroad, especially the Middle East.
Who are some of the good folks in Congress?
Pat
particularly on
Toomey,
the Republican side.
So on the Republican
Pat
side,
Toomey?
Pat Toomey actually was the lead sponsor of the resolution condemning the atrocities in Chechnya last year. And he's not somebody that jumps out as kind of an LGBTQ friendly member of Congress, but I think that he saw that this was an opportunity for him to say, hey, I am fully against human rights abuses. He takes a kind of an iffy approach here at home, and I wouldn't say that HRC is anywhere near endorsing him yet, but at the same time, he does have this record.
Well, he also stepped forward on gun checks with Joe Manchin. It was Manchin Toomey.
Outside of my purview.
Anyway. No, Toomey's name is popping up now and then. Who are some of the others?
So Chairman Ed Royce of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, there was a hearing last year? Mark Bromley actually is here in the room. He testified at that hearing, and I believe that Mark was the first person ever to testify at a congressional hearing on an LGBTQ human rights issue internationally. And that was something that Chairman Royce signed on to at the urging of David Cicilline, who is a Democrat from Rhode Island, openly gay Democrat. But Royce did agree to it and did have Mark on the panel, and it was a really good hearing. And so there are, I've heard that Royce also raises the issues in meetings occasionally.
What about state governments? One of the things is, you see, Washington tied more in knots, and one of the things I've noticed is that governors are, whether they're Republican or Democrat, seem to be playing much more of a vital international role. Have you noticed governors of import raising LGBT or other kinds of civil rights issues when they go abroad? I know they're doing this on the environment. I have no idea what they're doing on.
I can't say I've heard cases of governors raising it abroad. I do know that certain governors are raising it very vocally on the domestic side of things, but I can't say I've heard about it abroad. But if others have seen that, I'm happy to be corrected.
Let me ask all of you, when you're thinking about this, and I've watched Russia, for instance, shift into, these parts of Russian leadership shift into, really an obsessive discrimination against the LGBT community. And I was worried because, I know lots of Russians who are just like anybody else in Washington, very normalized, very embracing, and no problem. But then when you see ISIS throwing people off walls, you see the demonization that has gone on. And you do see subcultures developing in a lot of these countries. I'm sure many of you who've traveled in the region know that there are very healthy gay, I know the gay side, I don't know the rest of the equation, but subcultures in these communities that sort of feel like they've got space to do what they're doing. But there's a demonization that is pretty horrific in these countries. And I'm just wondering, all of you deal with this on a daily basis much more than I do. Why? What is driving ISIS, or what is driving the antithesis of ISIS to demonize the LGBTQ community to the degree? Do we understand what is going on?
Yeah. First of all, when we talk about the sub areas, among our cities, especially when you talk about, personally, I want to talk about Jordan. It's always the privileged, the rich men, gay men, who always can live in these neighborhoods where it's literally more like the most open, so it's more comes with the privileges, also these spaces. And the spaces we are trying to create is a space to everyone, for lesbian women, for transgender, for every person. That's really important to focus on. These spaces when you go, for example, to the gay bar in Amman or to the certain areas in Rainbow Street, it's really for mostly privileged persons. However, I want to say also on the other side with ISIS, it's actually let people question, in Jordan, is that truly what our values? Is that truly the Islamic values? And then we try to question more about, we have tolerance in our Islamic values. We have mercy, we have acceptance, and we start to discuss these issues. And therefore, from these issues, from that, what we've seen of the extremist level of how you can implement the religion in a way, it came up with the extremist backlash on how you can be tolerated for every other person.
May?
I would also add that while it's certainly true that there are the cases of ISIS extremists throwing LGBT individuals off of roofs, cases like that, it's still really important to recognize that secular governments are also cracking down against their people in the Middle East. Religion plays a part, no doubt.
I mentioned Russia
Yeah, yeah.
because not that Russia would fall in the Middle East, but you see governments
That are entirely
and
secular.
authorities going after this. I mean, it reminds me of the 1930s when Jews were demonized in such a horrific way and dehumanized. And I'm just wondering whether, given all of your, I mean, particularly May, you deal with the kind of legal infrastructure. What's the DNA of that?
Well, just to finish my thought,
Sorry to
so
interrupt.
no, it's okay. So religion plays a part, certainly, just like it does here in the United States. Social values play a part, but these are things that can be changed, interpretations that can be thought of. Even if your religious beliefs don't change, people can start to accommodate each other using systems that are created in the law. So I would also urge people to think that it's not just an ISIS problem. It's a secular Middle Eastern dictator problem, because those dictators are interested in controlling the narrative, controlling what a Middle Easterner looks like, or what a citizen looks like, what a good citizen is like, someone who doesn't challenge the status quo in their political opinions, but also in their sexual orientation. So that's something that I really want to urge and really stress, I would say, as well.
Antun?
And I'll just add on to that by just why the LGBT community in particular is the one that's always kind of the punching bag, is because it's a low cost. It's the most vulnerable community, and there is a very low cost in demonizing, targeting, cracking down, making it very public. It reinforces the legitimacy that May was saying before about regimes having this kind of, religious kind of reinforcing their religious kind of religiosity in front of their people, who are mostly conservative. And homophobia is a very easy and widespread held sentiment in religious circles, as we know in this country as well. So it's an easy, low cost, opportunity to crack down on a very vulnerable community, and that's why the LGBT community is always the one. And in Egypt, it's not unique what happened recently. They do this every 4 or 5 years, irrespective of the government, whether it's going to be Muslim Brotherhood or it's Mubarak or it's Sisi. It's an old game out of that they keep on, Arab regimes keep doing, whether secular or Islamists or so forth. It's cracking down on a vulnerable community that has low cost but a lot of benefit in terms of whipping up public sentiment in their favour. So and that's why we keep seeing it over and over again. But I will add just what Hassan was saying before. I mean, that is the demonising aspect, which is a recurring issue. But there are strides that are being made that we need to recognise. And so the Arab Spring, I guess one of the legacies of the Arab Spring, which is still ongoing, is that it created a bit of a social revolution. All of a sudden, what Hassan was saying before about these conversations that are being had now that weren't being had before. People are talking about what does it mean to be a woman in the Middle East now? What does it mean to have individual rights in the Middle East?
The Middle East Institute is having an LGBTQ forum.
Exactly. So this is part of the conversation.
Did you get in trouble with anybody? Any Saudi funders call you
no,
and say?
We did just get some hate mail, but it's okay. These conversations are being had on a broader level when it comes to, and this is something that's a new development. Previously, the sentiment, I guess, in the Middle East was that homosexuality was a Western import. It had nothing to do with, Ahmadinejad, who's not Arab, but it was that same sentiment.
We have no gays.
We have no gays. It's a Western thing. Now there is acknowledgement that it kind of exists in our society, and that's a big step forward. We have a word in Arabic that media is now using, depending on who's backing them, but there is a term now in Arabic to describe homosexuality, which we never had before, which isn't derogatory. So there are strides being made, conversations are being had. There is an acknowledgement that homosexuality now, or sexuality diversity, as I like to call it, is kind of part of Arab and Islamic society, which wasn't there before, and I think that's important to
Hassan?
acknowledge.
Also, I just want to add. Sorry. No. Okay, so can you hear me?
We have to make sure that the millions of people watching online in Amman can hear you right now.
So also I want
Hold it a little closer.
Yeah, it's really important to mention that also that is made the LGBT community is very close to the feminist community, to women's rights community, to lots of several communities that become really more united as also, again, as a response to what they see in other countries, or especially with the incidents of ISIS. That's really important to mention. So what we face as a LGBTQ community, honestly, or as a gay person in specific, could be any different women face in the same level. So that would make our struggles very much similar and would make us more united at the same place.
Jeremy, you thoughts on this? On the DNA of the, is your mic bad too? Sorry about that.
No, I don't know. I didn't try that one.
Okay.
Thoughts on the DNA of the Middle East and how it's changing?
I mean, I think in terms of what you know or feel about the demonization of this community, but I can turn it around a little bit. I mean, I'm sort of interested in how you move the other direction. Yeah. Some of you may remember the journalist James Foley, who was killed. Short story on that: James Foley was detained in Libya with an Atlantic stringer and a photographer. And I had just been in Libya. And long story short, my boss, David Bradley, our chairman, was able to work with various people, and we got James Foley freed and released along with our stringer and someone else right before we began bombing Libya and all this. And it was a good story. And then the bad part of it is James went and got retaken by ISIS in Syria. A lot of other journalists at that time were taken as well, and my boss became very embedded in trying to get him free. And when he was killed, it was a horrible day, and ISIS put out pictures. And I put out a photo of James saying this is how he should be remembered. And it went pretty globally viral, but I began then getting a flood of ISIS-affiliated and ISIS wannabe, as you called it, hate mail through Twitter. And rather than shutting them down, I began to have, as much as I could, conversations with them, saying how were they communicating on smartphones? What would their societies do that they were producing? Did they realize that if they had an Apple iPhone or an iPhone, that the CEO of that company was gay? And half of them were horrible to me, and eventually they shut me off. But a good number of others were actually going back and trying to have a conversation about how the world they were going to have was going to create these things and be innovative and modern. And you could sort of, what happened is I refused to give up and kept having this conversation with these people, not thinking I won them over, but I thought it would be a good demonstration lesson as opposed. And then finally, these ISIS folks shut me down. But it really showed me that some of the followers out there are hijackable by rational conversation to some degree. And so I guess I'm going to ask you in this question of the demon, do you think there are social media opportunities? Do you think there are strategies that we're somehow missing to move a message of tolerance and rights that we're not doing, that we're just too, I guess, blunt about it, that we're not really engaging people with that? And I'm not sure that my experience is relevant, but it was a very fascinating one.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question, and I have a few answers to that. But first, I actually want to answer your previous question about the Republicans in Congress, because I should rightly be roundly criticized for forgetting to mention Ileana Ross-Layton from Florida, who has been a champion of LGBTQ rights much more than almost any other Republican. And if I failed to mention her name, then I should be kicked off the panel. So of
course, Ileana and Ed Royce are both retiring this year.
Well, let's not get into that. Yeah, we'll mourn that. I
live in cynicism.
Yeah,
so.
no, and I think that that's not an offhanded comment entirely, because I think that oftentimes it is the more veteran members of the Republican caucus who are sometimes a little bit more willing, because they come from sort of that old Republican style, a little more moderate style. But hopefully that the new crop of Republicans that are coming in, while they may be coming from more firebrand bases, I think that they are younger, and younger people tend to skew a little bit more friendly to LGBTQ people. So hopefully that'll sort of balance it out. But I wanted to answer your question about other strategies that we might not be looking at. And I think that the thing that I push for in my work is largely strategies that help the LGBTQ community to build up their resources. It's exciting that there's a word for homosexuality that is not laden with the kind of bigotry that has been in the past. And I think that that's through the kind of hard work of people on the ground. You don't just invent a word without people pushing it and trying to make sure that people start using it. And that's hard work, and that's the kind of thing that I think is really important. But I also want to take off my lobbyist hat for a moment and actually talk a little bit about some work that HRC does here at home that we're now sort of pushing more abroad, which is our Corporate Equality Index. So we started almost 20 years ago to rate corporations and say, are your policies friendly to LGBTQ people? Are you, allowing people to, with same-sex partners before they could get married? Could they get benefits through the health insurance program? Do you have trans-friendly policies? Do you have bathrooms available that everyone can use regardless of their gender? Things like that. And so, we have seen hundreds of corporations sign on to these policies and get 100% scores here in the United States. And now we're beginning to push that out outside the United States. And we're starting to hear so many people outside the United States look to develop these as well. And we're seeing it a lot in the Western Hemisphere. And hopefully we'll start to see it in the Middle East as well, so that corporations can start to sort of push that forward.
How are the oil companies and defense contractors?
They're by and large, they're actually pretty good when it comes to their internal policies, and I think that, I don't want to get into like a huge, discussion over oil companies and defense contractors, but at the same time, I think that there's a real recognition among the largest corporations, which many of those are, that, these are policies that help to drive the agenda forward, and it helps to give them a, to really show that they share progressive values. And so I think that there's a recognition that they can really drive that agenda forward and help in that way.
I want to bring May in, but I would just say oil firms and defense contractors are really important in certain parts of the power points in the region, because native citizens of these countries go work for these companies, and so if they become inculcated with that culture, it really does have an impact. I mean, I'm at a lot of parties with oil firms and defense contractors, and I worry if they're doing their job in gender balance and other kinds of rights issues. May?
Yeah, I think one thing that is really helpful, you reminded me when you mentioned social media, is what I alluded to before, support for these public diplomacy efforts. So support for radio channels that are popping up, support for magazines, support for social media campaigns. It was actually a social media campaign in conjunction with a few other things that in Lebanon and Tunisia ultimately led to the stopping of anal exams that are used on men who identify as gay. Because the framing of the issue, activists started calling them tests of shame, and in some cases rape tests. And the fact that people began to think of these tests as rape really changed the narrative and ultimately led to changes in these countries. So these social media campaigns can be extremely powerful. I would say the minor caveat is that civil society activists working on LGBT issues in the Middle East have been doing this for decades, and they know their situations best. So I would urge that any sort of international solidarity that's done is done under the leadership of the locals, because they are in each country, thank you, in each country they know their context, they know what successes and what challenges they face. And I would say that if anyone wants to be an ally, the best thing they can do is really communicate with the people on the ground, identify where they can best amplify and support, and then support accordingly.
I'd like to go to the audience, but Hassan, do you want to comment quickly on two quick thoughts?
Just the last comment on the top of what she said. Also, as we said, like that is a lot of work was happened on social media. However, nowadays on Facebook, you need to do like identify yourself when you have to create your accounts, or sometimes they stop accounts to identify yourself, and that also will put some people in risk. And I think that something need to be done from here, which is really stop this identification things for like the accounts owners, because this is going to be exposing lots of activists in a way or another.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Andrew?
to expand on Hassan's point, Facebook started making individuals identify themselves by their full names. Historically, for example, in Egypt and other countries, LGBT activists had used fake names. So this identification tactic actually hurt them, because it made them come out with their names, some of whom weren't ready. It made police much more able to crack down on them, authorities and stuff. So Hassan's point is a policy recommendation for Facebook to consider if there's something that can be done on this issue.